My divorce papers had been sitting inside my briefcase for almost 3 weeks. I carried them with me everywhere like a quiet reminder that my marriage was already over, even if the final conversation hadn't happened yet. 23 years together had somehow dissolved into silence, routine, and distance so gradual that I couldn't even remember the exact moment things started breaking apart. I was the CEO of a mid-sized technology company, a job that required making difficult decisions constantly. I had laid off employees, negotiated hostile takeovers, and closed entire departments without losing sleep. But the decision waiting inside that envelope felt heavier than anything I had ever done professionally. At home, my wife and I had slowly become strangers sharing the same house. Our conversations had been reduced to practical updates about bills, schedules, and errands. We slept on opposite sides of the bed, careful not to disturb each other. Even our dinners felt like meetings between coworkers who had run out of topics to discuss. 3 weeks earlier, I had finally accepted what I believed was the truth. Our marriage had quietly died, and all that remained was the paperwork to confirm it. That Thursday afternoon, I left the office early to meet my attorney one final time before delivering the papers at home that evening. The meeting was brief. Everything was prepared, all the signatures ready except mine. When I walked back to my car, I realized I still had almost 2 hours before I needed to go home. Instead of driving directly back, I started moving through the city without a clear destination, replaying in my head the speech I planned to give her. I had rehearsed it dozens of times. I would explain that she deserved someone better, someone more present and emotionally available, someone who could give her the life she wanted instead of the quiet, exhausting routine we had fallen into. Eventually, I found myself parking near a small coffee shop called Riverside Café. I remembered my wife mentioning it once or twice when she talked about meeting friends from her book club. The place seemed quiet enough for me to sit, think, and prepare myself for the conversation that would end our marriage. Inside, the cafe smelled like fresh espresso and warm pastries. Brick walls and old wooden tables gave the place a relaxed atmosphere that almost made it feel like a refuge from the rest of the city. I ordered a black coffee and chose a small table partially hidden behind a tall bookshelf. It was the kind of corner where you could sit unnoticed for hours. I opened my laptop and tried to focus on work emails, but my attention kept drifting back to the briefcase beside my chair. The envelope inside felt like it weighed 20 pounds. I kept imagining the moment I would place it on the kitchen table and watch my wife realize what it meant. Then I heard a laugh that stopped me completely. It was a sound I knew better than almost anything else in my life. My wife was sitting at a table near the window with 3 women. Through the gap between books on the shelf, I could see her profile clearly. For a moment, I considered standing up and leaving immediately, but something kept me in my seat. Maybe curiosity, maybe fear. I wasn't sure. Then one of the women spoke loudly enough that I could hear every word. She said she didn't understand how my wife tolerated living with someone as cold and distant as me. Another voice joined in, describing how uncomfortable I looked at social gatherings, how I rarely spoke during conversations, how I often left events early. Sitting behind that bookshelf, listening to them dissect my personality and my marriage, I felt a familiar weight settle in my chest. Every comment confirmed what I had already believed. I was the problem. I had failed at being the husband she deserved. I had become the quiet, emotionally unavailable man her friends clearly thought I was. I should have stood up and left the cafe right then. Instead, I stayed where I was, completely still, listening as they continued discussing my marriage as if I weren't even a real person. Then suddenly my wife's voice cut through the conversation, and the tone in her voice was something I hadn't heard in a very long time. It was sharp, firm, and completely unexpected. She interrupted them before anyone else could continue. Her voice was calm but firm in a way that immediately changed the atmosphere at the table. Even from across the cafe, I could hear the shift in her tone. "That's enough," she said. The women looked surprised, as if they hadn't expected her to push back. One of them tried to laugh it off, saying they were only joking and that they were concerned about her. But my wife didn't smile. She set her cup down slowly and looked directly at them. "You don't understand him," she said quietly. None of you do. Sitting behind the bookshelf, I felt my chest tighten. I had spent months convinced she agreed with everything they were saying about me. Every silent car ride home after one of those social events, every moment she seemed distant or disappointed, had convinced me she felt the same way they did. But the way she spoke now didn't sound like someone who agreed with them at all. He's not cold, she continued. He's exhausted. The table went quiet. One of her friends started to object, but my wife raised her hand slightly, stopping her. You want to know why he left the Henderson dinner early? She asked. Because he had been at the office since 5 in the morning, dealing with a crisis that could have cost 200 people their jobs. He came home for 15 minutes, changed clothes, and still went to that dinner because he knew it mattered to me. Hearing her describe that evening felt strange. At the time, I had thought she barely noticed the effort. I had assumed she only saw the awkward silence I created at the party, not the exhaustion behind it. But she remembered every detail. He works 60 hours a week, she continued, her voice gaining strength. Not because he loves being busy, but because he feels responsible for the people who depend on him. When he comes to those events you all love so much, he's already used up every bit of social energy he has. One of the women crossed her arms and said that if he really cared, he would try harder to fit in. My wife let out a short laugh, but it wasn't amused. You think love is about performing at parties? She asked. Let me tell you something he did last week. I mentioned my car was making a strange noise. The next morning he rearranged his entire schedule, took it to the mechanic himself, and waited there for 2 hours so I wouldn't have to deal with it. I remembered that morning clearly. To me it had been a small, practical task, nothing worth mentioning. I had never imagined she would see it as anything meaningful. But she continued listing small things I had completely forgotten about. Notes I left in the margins of books she was reading. Conversations we had about philosophy during our quiet Sunday mornings. Little things I had done simply because I knew they mattered to her. Each example landed like a shock. For months I had believed my efforts meant nothing. Listening to her defend me in that cafe forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about our marriage. You all keep saying he doesn't care, she said, her voice softer now. But the truth is, he shows love in ways you don't recognize. One of the women argued that he still seemed distant and uninterested whenever they saw him. My wife shook her head slowly. That's because every time we go to one of your events, someone makes a comment about him. About his job, his personality, the way he talks, the way he dresses. Little things that sound harmless but add up over time. I felt my grip tighten around the coffee cup in my hands. I had noticed those comments, of course, but I had assumed my wife didn't. I thought she was embarrassed by me the same way her friends clearly were. Instead, she had been noticing everything. You've been cutting him down for years, she continued, and he keeps showing up anyway because he knows I want him there. The silence that followed felt heavy. For the first time since I arrived at the cafe, I realized something important. The distance in our marriage might not have come from what I thought it did. Sitting behind that bookshelf, listening to my wife defend me with more honesty than I had heard in years, I felt something shift inside me. The divorce papers in my briefcase suddenly felt less like a solution and more like a terrible mistake I was about to make. One of her friends finally broke the silence, sounding slightly defensive now. She insisted they had only been trying to help. According to her, they were worried my wife deserved someone who could give her a more exciting life. Someone more social. Someone who enjoyed the kind of gatherings and events they all loved attending. My wife looked at them for a long moment before answering. You think excitement is the same thing as happiness, she said quietly. But that's not the life I chose. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness behind it that made the table fall silent again. She explained that when she married me, she didn't choose someone who would entertain people at gallery openings or dominate conversations at dinner parties. She chose someone steady, someone dependable, someone who showed love through actions instead of speeches. Listening from my seat across the room, I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes. For so long I had believed she was disappointed in the man I had become. I had convinced myself that every quiet moment between us was proof that I had failed her somehow. But now I was hearing something completely different. "Do you know why he reads the books I'm reading?" she continued. "Because he knows I love discussing ideas. Even when he's exhausted after work, he still reads them so we have something to talk about on Sunday mornings." That comment caught me completely off guard. I had started doing that years ago when our conversations had begun shrinking into practical matters. I thought the notes I left in her books were barely noticed. I had assumed they were just another attempt that didn't really matter. Apparently, they mattered more than I realized. One of the women sighed and said, "My wife deserved someone more emotionally expressive, someone who could give her affection in obvious ways instead of quiet gestures." My wife leaned back slightly in her chair and shook her head. "You keep describing the wrong problem," she said. "My husband isn't emotionally distant. He's overwhelmed." She paused before continuing, her voice softer now. "And lately I think I've made that worse." That sentence made my heart stop for a moment. Her friends looked confused, clearly not expecting that response. She explained that over the past few years she had been trying harder and harder to maintain a social life that didn't actually suit either of us. Book clubs, gallery events, dinner parties, constant lunches with people who analyzed every detail of other people's relationships. She admitted that after spending time with them, she often came home feeling drained and frustrated. Instead of recognizing where those feelings were coming from, she had allowed them to spill into our marriage. She would become quiet and distant, and I would respond by withdrawing further, assuming I had done something wrong. Listening to her describe the pattern so clearly felt like watching someone finally explain a puzzle that had confused me for years. What I had interpreted as rejection might have actually been exhaustion. What she thought was disappointment from me might have been my own insecurity about not fitting into her social world. "You've been slowly convincing me that my marriage was broken," she said to her friends. "But the truth is, I was the one bringing that tension home." The women looked uncomfortable now. One of them tried to argue that they were simply encouraging her to expect more from life. My wife shook her head again. "I already have the life I wanted," she said firmly. "The problem is that I forgot to protect it." Sitting there behind that bookshelf, I realized something that made my stomach drop. While I had spent weeks preparing divorce papers because I believed she was unhappy with me, she had been preparing to confront the people who were slowly poisoning how she saw our relationship. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Hope. Her friends exchanged uneasy looks after that. Patricia was the first to speak again, though her confidence had clearly faded. She insisted they were only trying to help my wife see the reality of the situation. According to her, a relationship should be exciting, full of social activity and energy, not quiet evenings and routine conversations. My wife listened without interrupting, then leaned forward slightly. "You think I'm unhappy because my life isn't loud enough," she said. "But the truth is, I've been unhappy because I've been trying to keep up with a life that isn't actually mine." The table went quiet again. She explained that the constant lunches, book club meetings, gallery openings, and dinner parties had slowly started feeling less like friendships and more like obligations. She had convinced herself that maintaining that circle was important, even when it left her exhausted by the end of every week. What she hadn't realized was how much that exhaustion was affecting our marriage. By the time she came home after spending hours in conversations filled with criticism and comparison, she had nothing left emotionally. Instead of recognizing that pattern, she had assumed the emptiness came from our relationship itself. Hearing her describe it that way made something painfully clear to me. For months, I had been blaming myself for the distance between us, convinced that I had become the kind of husband she regretted choosing. Meanwhile, she had been slowly realizing that the tension wasn't coming from our marriage at all. It was coming from the outside voices constantly questioning it. One of the women finally asked why my wife seemed so unhappy whenever they saw her, if she was truly satisfied with her life. My wife sighed softly before answering. "Because I've been pretending to enjoy things that drain me," she admitted. "And when you spend enough time pretending, eventually you forget what you actually want." That statement hung in the air for several seconds. She went on to explain that for the past few weeks she had been seriously considering stepping away from the entire social circle. She had even been planning to leave the book club and stop attending most of the events they organized. Not because she disliked them personally, but because the environment had become toxic for her marriage. Sitting there behind the bookshelf, I felt my entire understanding of the past few years begin to shift. While I had been preparing to walk away from our marriage out of guilt and resignation, she had been preparing to defend it. "I'm done trying to fit into a version of life that doesn't work for me," she said quietly. "And I'm definitely done listening to people who constantly criticize the person I chose to marry." Patricia looked stunned. She asked if my wife was really willing to throw away years of friendship over something like that. My wife answered without hesitation. "If the friendship requires me to question my marriage every time we meet, then yes." The firmness in her voice left no room for debate. Her friends began gathering their things, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. One of them muttered that she was making a mistake and would eventually regret cutting herself off from people who were only trying to help. My wife didn't argue anymore. She simply stood up from the table and placed some money beside her empty cup. As the women walked toward the door, the cafe grew quiet again. I remained frozen behind the bookshelf, trying to process everything I had just heard. The envelope in my briefcase suddenly felt completely different than it had when I walked into the cafe earlier that afternoon. A few minutes later, my wife sat back down alone at the table. She covered her face with both hands, and I realized she was crying quietly. Not the dramatic crying of someone seeking sympathy, but the exhausted kind that comes after finally saying something you've been holding inside for a long time. Watching her like that made the decision in front of me suddenly very clear. I reached down, picked up my briefcase, and stood up from my chair. For the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I picked up my briefcase and walked slowly around the bookshelf that had been hiding me for the past half hour. Each step felt strangely heavy, as if I were crossing the line between two completely different versions of my life. My wife didn't notice me at first. She was still sitting at the table near the window, wiping her eyes and staring down at the empty cup in front of her. When I stopped beside the table and pulled out the chair across from her, she looked up suddenly. For a moment, her expression was pure confusion. Then recognition hit her, followed immediately by panic. "How long have you been here?" she asked quietly. I sat down across from her and placed my briefcase on the floor beside my chair. "Long enough," I said. Her face turned pale as she realized what that probably meant. I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that I had just heard every painful word spoken about our marriage. For years I had delivered difficult conversations in boardrooms without hesitation, but sitting there across from her, I felt completely unprepared. "I heard what you said," I continued, "about me." She looked down at the table, clearly bracing herself for whatever came next. Slowly, I opened my briefcase and pulled out the large envelope that had been sitting inside it for weeks. I placed it gently on the table between us. Her eyes fixed on it immediately. "What is that?" she asked, though I could tell she already suspected the answer. I took a slow breath before answering. "Divorce papers." The word hung between us like something fragile and dangerous. Her eyes widened in shock. "You were going to give those to me today?" she whispered. I nodded once. "I thought you were unhappy," I admitted. "I thought I had become the reason your life felt small and frustrating. Every event we went to, every conversation that ended in silence, I thought you were slowly realizing you married the wrong person." She stared at me as if the idea itself hurt to hear. "I never wanted to leave you," she said softly. "I wanted to leave all of that." She gestured vaguely toward the door where her friends had disappeared only minutes earlier. The constant criticism, the pressure to live a life that never felt like ours. I sat there quietly for a moment, letting that sink in. For weeks I had convinced myself that the kindest thing I could do for her was walk away. But everything I had overheard suggested the opposite. She had been defending me while I was preparing to leave. Slowly, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. It was the first time she had touched me like that in months. "I'm exhausted," she said quietly. "Not because of you, because I've been trying to maintain friendships and expectations that were slowly poisoning how I saw my own marriage." I turned my hand slightly so our fingers intertwined. "I'm exhausted too," I admitted. "Work has been draining everything out of me. By the time I get home, I barely have the energy to speak, and when you seem disappointed with me, I just shut down more." She shook her head. "I wasn't disappointed in you. I was disappointed in myself for letting other people define what our life should look like." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The cafe noise continued around us, but it felt strangely distant. Finally, I picked up the envelope again, looked at it for a moment, and then slowly tore it in half. The paper ripped loudly in the quiet space between us. I folded the pieces again and tore them once more before letting them fall onto the table. My wife watched in silence, her eyes filling with tears again, but this time they looked different. Not exhausted, but relieved. "Where do we start?" I asked quietly. She smiled faintly for the first time that afternoon. "We start by going home," she said, "and remembering that we're supposed to be on the same side." As we left the cafe together, walking side by side through the late afternoon sunlight, I realized how close we had come to losing everything because of misunderstandings and outside noise. The divorce papers that had once felt inevitable were now just torn scraps of paper. And for the first time in months, the silence between us didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a new beginning,